I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 173rd episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing betterment of your brain by any and all means at your disposal. One topic which is not unknown to us that we've covered before on this show is omega-3 fatty acids, their prevalence in fish oils and krill oil, things like that, the pros and cons of getting fats from animal versus vegetable sources, and generally omega-3s get a pretty clean bill of health, a lot of upsides, minimal downsides. But in this episode, we're going to be kind of looking at the dark underbelly of omega-3s. Might there be some reasons why omega-3 supplements could actually be doing more harm than good and something that you might want to steer clear of? We're never shy about courting controversy or punching our past episodes in the face, so we're going to be talking in this episode with Chris Kresser about omega-3 fatty acids and the warning label that perhaps in some cases they ought to come with. That'll be in the main interview. If you wait around until the very end of the episode, in case I've just ruined your day and made you want to clear out your medicine cabinet, I'll give you some good news for your mood at least, something scientifically backed that you can do very easily that is increasingly credible as a natural mood enhancer. That'll be in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick. But as usual, let's kick things off first with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So at some point you've been watching some old sci-fi movie and you've no doubt seen the live brain in a jar. This is sort of a mainstay of 1950s sci-fi and Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory, stuff like that. And while I think brains in a jar are still a ways off, we're actually getting somewhat closer to having a jar-like material able to enclose a living brain. Weird but true, but actually a lot of benefits that could come out from this technology. There is something called a Window to the Brain project that's going on jointly between the University of California at Riverside and a Mexican university whose name I'm about to butcher, but I'll try. The Centro de Investigación Científica Educación Superior de Ensenada. That is abbreviated CICESE. Anyway, the Window to the Brain project is almost exactly what it sounds like. Scientists have developed a material which is transparent and yet highly resistant to damage, resistant to scratches, think like the surface of your iPhone screen, that they can actually use to replace portions of skull to allow scientists to peer into living brains as they're doing their thing. This is, as you might imagine, not an elective procedure just yet, and in fact, it's mostly been performed in hamsters, for whom nothing is elective. But the idea is that this could be useful therapeutically for patients with serious brain conditions that they need their doctors to be able to have ongoing access, not just to look at their brain, but actually potentially to be able to do some procedures on their brain through this transparent surface. We've talked in past episodes about optogenetics, the idea of making things happen in various brain cells by triggering them with light. That's one possibility. And another thing that's really interesting is in any kind of surgery, there's always the possibility of a bacterial infection taking place after the fact. In a further lab study, the researchers treated an E. coli infection that took place in a hamster brain following the implantation of one of these devices using nothing but laser light shown through the transparent material, says David Binder, a neurosurgeon and neuroscientist at the University of California at Riverside School of Medicine. This was an important finding because it showed that the combination of our transparent implants and laser-based therapies enables us to not only treat brain disorders, but to tackle the bacterial infections that are common after cranial implants. These infections are especially challenging to treat because many antibiotics do not penetrate the blood-brain barrier. The biggest benefit to the Window to the Brain project, in addition to just being really neat, being able to see a live brain in real time, is that for serious conditions where there might be multiple surgeries necessary, it doesn't require continually reopening the skull, as would happen under the current standard of care. To accomplish this, the researchers have developed a version of the material known as yttria-stabilized zirconia. That's YSZ for you acronym fans. This is a ceramic material better known for its use in hip implants and dental crowns. The researchers published their hamster study in the journal Nanomedicine, Nanotechnology, Biology, and Medicine, in which they claim that the internal toughness of the YSZ material is both more impact-resistant and biocompatible than competitor technologies, and makes it, I quote, the only current transparent skull implant that could conceivably be used in humans. Brain pathologies on which the Window to the Brain technology might be used include brain cancers, traumatic brain injury, stroke, and neurodegenerative diseases. Normally, the treatments here might require repeated craniotomies. That's the name of the procedure where they open up a bone flap in the skull. But the hope is that a small YSZ window plate could make this a one-time procedure.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title. Twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews from our listeners down under. Everlasting Prosperity says, the unbelievable amount of information packed into each episode is just amazing. Unbiased and well set out. And Neve Star, also from Australia, says, being something of a nerd myself, doing a PhD in exercise for cognitive function in cancer patients, I've devoured the majority of these podcasts since discovering SDS just a few weeks ago and wait eagerly for the next one to come out. Well, thank you both so very much. It's always fun to see the international reviews come in. Obviously, being an English language podcast, we are pretty well siloed into the English speaking world, but given that caveat, the amount of worldwide listenership is really pretty amazing and just fun to look at on a map. Also international in its ambitions is axonlabs.io, the retail end of things over here at Smart Drug Smarts, where we do ship to most parts of the world, English speaking or not. There's a few black holes in our ability to actually ship things. We don't ship to Germany, for example, which is a bummer, but some countries have more red tape than others and just makes these things not feasible. But odds are pretty good that if you're listening to this, you are a potential Axon Labs customer. If you have not tried the stacks Nexus or Mitogen, both of those can be found over at axonlabs.io. Different, but equally good. We love them each in their own special way. It seems like for the initial kick, Mitogen gets a little bit more of a yow factor from people. Mitogen is the mitochondrial one of the two, but I think those acute effects taper off a bit over the course of the first couple of weeks. I do cycle off of Mitogen occasionally, kind of reboot my tolerance, and that seems to be pretty effective and also a pretty good idea to do with almost anything that you're going to be taking. It's generally a good idea to keep your body guessing, not let it know exactly what's coming next. Speaking of not knowing what comes next, there will be a Brain Breakfast newsletter publishing in the next day or two. If you have not yet signed up for our email newsletter, it is easy to do so. There is a sign-up link in the footer of any given page on smartdrugsmarts.com, and there's also a dedicated sign-up page at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So we've had a couple of episodes on the virtues of omega-3 fatty acids and fish oil supplementation, as well of course, real live fish or real dead fish, the kind that you might be eating. But as with most things, of course, there's pros and cons for how you get these substances into your body. It's not just what they are, but how you get them there, what's coming along for the ride. And for omega-3s, there's a lot of different things to consider. There's the natural fish, and might that have mercury or other seaborne toxins? Or if we go with the supplements, might we be missing out on something that maybe hasn't even been identified, but is going to be helpful as well? If we go with a non-meat source, something that's purely vegetable, will we have the same level of bioavailability? Will that be a viable alternative to eating something that comes from an animal source? A couple of years ago, Chris Kresser wrote an article entitled, Should You Really Be Taking Fish Oil? And just did a recent follow-up this current January. I caught him for a conversation. Chris Kresser is one of the leading thinkers and voices in the paleo and ancestral nutrition movement. He is the author of the book, The Paleo Cure, along with more lengthy and highly sourced online blog posts than you can shake a stick at. His website, not surprisingly, is chriskresser.com. And we're going to be talking here about fish oils, inflammation, oxidation, the necessity of getting fat into your diet, and also some warnings and best practices on how to actually do that effectively. This is a nice follow-up episode to the conversation that I had a few weeks ago with Dr. Chris Masterjohn, and also in many ways a follow-up to episode number 51, still one of my favorites, in which I spoke with Dr. Michael Crawford from the Imperial College London. So a fatty oceanic interview coming up with both some warnings and also some recommendations on how to actually go about food preparation. We talk about cooking oils and how much of various things to eat. But with no further ado, let's jump in with Chris Kresser.
Early on, there was a lot of enthusiasm about fish oil, and the party line was, hey, fish oil can solve a lot of problems that are related to a crappy diet. You eat a crappy diet, you just fish oil yourself out of that crappy diet, and you'll be okay. I mean, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I think there was some truth to how that was portrayed in the media. Just take some fish oil, and that will reduce the inflammatory load that you're causing by following an inflammatory diet and lifestyle. And I think that's actually a key point, because it's one of the dangers of relying too much on supplementation, because there's this kind of compensation effect that happens where you think, oh, I'm taking all these supplements, so I probably don't need to pay as much attention to the other things that are important for health. And that's actually mentioned in some of these studies where fish oil was associated with poor outcomes. They actually speculated that in some cases it may have been related to what I just mentioned. So, initially there was a ton of enthusiasm about fish oil, particularly its benefits for cardiovascular disease, but also other conditions, brain health, skin conditions, arthritis, really kind of any inflammatory disease. But over the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of research, including some very long-running randomized clinical trials and some really good meta-analyses that have really questioned those those putative benefits of fish oil and either found that there was no benefit or in some cases even potential harm. I wrote an article in 2015 highlighting some of these claims, and then I recently updated it in 2017, just now in January, with even more recent evidence that threw these claims into further doubt. So I think where we're at is essentially in a big reevaluation of the initial enthusiasm for fish oil, and now finding that in the case of many conditions, particularly cardiovascular disease, there appears to be no benefit and possibly even harm associated with larger doses.
What is the worst outcome that a person might expect if they are supplementing with fish oil other than a hole in their wallet?
Well, fish oil consists of long-chain fatty acids, EPA and DHA, and these fats are extremely fragile and susceptible to oxidative damage. And that can happen outside of the body, just in the capsule itself, because they're susceptible to light and heat. And so if the fish oil isn't processed very carefully, oxidative stress can be introduced at any point in that processing, and the fish oil in the capsules themselves can become oxidized. There have been recent studies that have shown that the top brands, the 3 top selling fish oil supplements in the US, were shown to have oxidation levels of up to 4 times higher than what those that are recommended to be safe, which is pretty significant. And then these oils can also become oxidized in the body. So if your oxidative stress levels are high because of inadequate physical activity and poor diet and all of the other things that cause oxidative stress related to modern diet and lifestyle, those long-chain omega-3 fats can oxidize in the body. In either case, what's at stake is that oxidative stress is essentially linked to virtually all chronic inflammatory diseases, from heart disease to arthritis to dementia and Alzheimer's to autoimmune diseases of all types. So if you're consuming oxidated oils, especially at high doses, I don't think the risk is as significant if you're taking, a moderate dose like 500 milligrams. But at 3 grams a day, which some mainstream organizations and practitioners of both conventional and alternative persuasions have recommended, or higher even, then there's a real risk that you could be increasing your inflammatory load. And we don't need that because we already have so many challenges in that regard.
Would there ever be any trade-off as far as maybe you're doing something that is not necessarily great for your overall physiology, circulatory system, your heart, but because omega-3s are still used in myelination of nerve cells in the brain, that it might be worth it for the brain even if your overall physiology might take a hit? Or are the brain and heart sort of always on the same side?
I would say it's pretty hard to separate them out because the brain is part of the whole vascular system in the body, is what carries blood to the brain, and blood has everything the brain needs to function properly. And it is true that omega-3s, particularly DHA, are absolutely crucial for brain health. So I want to be clear here. The message is not that omega-3s and EPA and DHA are not good for you or good for the brain. That's absolutely untrue. The message is that obtaining those fats from purified concentrated fish oils that may have become oxidized is not necessarily the best way to do it. I mean, the strong message in my article was eat fish and seafood. Absolutely. Do that because studies consistently show a strong positive association between fish and shellfish intake and all kinds of benefits, including brain health. So it's not about avoiding EPA or DHA. It's about getting it from food. That's how we evolved to obtain these nutrients, is from in the context of a whole foods diet, not in concentrated oils.
For people that might be vegan or anti-fish for whatever reason, are there any viable alternatives to supplementation?
Yeah, there's microalgae. So algae supplements contain DHA. That's actually where fish get DHA from. And why fish have high levels of DHA in their flesh is because they consume algae. And so you can get microalgae supplements that contain DHA in them if you're vegan or don't want to consume fish for any reason. But I should also point out that for those who are not vegetarian and they're willing to consume fish but just don't because it's not top of mind and maybe they don't like fish that much, there are a lot of other benefits to consuming seafood above and beyond the EPA and DHA, including highly absorbable source of protein and selenium and vitamin D and zinc and other nutrients that are not necessarily easy to obtain even from other foods in the diet. So just something to consider.
Yeah, it's worth finding a couple of seafood foods that you can stomach, even if it's not necessarily your favorite thing, because there are so many benefits there.
Exactly. And I would say if we're talking about brain health, if you were to ask me what are some of the most important foods for brain health, I would put shellfish in the top 3 for sure. Shellfish and organ meats are really the 2 most nutrient-dense sources of food when you look at pound for pound or ounce for ounce. They're extremely rich in a variety of nutrients that are not well represented elsewhere in the diet, like vitamin A. And by vitamin A, I mean the real active form of vitamin A, retinoic acid, not beta-carotene, which is in carrots and red peppers and is a precursor to vitamin A, but actual retinol. And that's important because some people don't make the conversion from beta-carotene to retinol very well. So eating preformed vitamin A, which only really occurs in organ meats and shellfish in any significant amount, maybe pasture-raised dairy to a lesser amount, but also copper and zinc, which are both important nutrients for brain health, and all of the B vitamins, which are important for methylation and neurotransmitter production and metabolism. So when you look at like organ meats, for example, with copper, all you need to do is eat 1 3-ounce serving of oysters and you've met your weekly allowance for copper. And that's true with a number of other nutrients. Oh, iron, of course, is a very important nutrient for brain health in organ meats and shellfish. So yeah, shellfish would be included in that when we say eat seafood for the omega-3s, but there are a lot of other reasons to consume shellfish and seafood.
A couple of years ago, I spoke with Dr. Michael Crawford, and I'm not sure if he originally proposed this theory or is just one of the major advocates of it, but there's a lot of reasons to think that rather than having turned from hominid ancestors of humans into humans on the plains of Africa, it was probably more on the seashores of Africa, just because that was probably the only environment where the available diet would have provided enough omega-3s where early humans would have been able to have their brains triple in size, simply because the foods that would provide those oils wouldn't have been available inland on the continent.
Yes, that is a fairly prominent theory of human evolution, hominid evolution, and I think there's a lot to be said for it, for sure. I mean, DHA and EPA. In nutrition, the standard idea is that the precursors to EPA and DHA, alpha-linolenic acid, essential. And by essential, I don't just mean really important. I mean essential in the context of nutrition means they must be obtained from the diet because the body cannot synthesize them on its own. So they have to be obtained through eating. But there's a pretty compelling argument advanced by Dr. Chris Masterjohn, a nutritional scientist, and others that suggests that the reason alpha-linolenic is essential is not because that fatty acid, which is found in things like walnuts and flaxseed and plant foods, it's not because alpha-linolenic is essential itself. It's because what it's ultimately converted into, which are EPA and DHA, the long-chain omega-3 fats you find in fish and algae, are essential. And if we obtain EPA and DHA from fish, we don't need alpha-linolenic acid. It's what we really need is the EPA and DHA. And so that theory of evolution, that people who advocate that say, well, if EPA and DHA are essential, then wouldn't it make sense that we evolved in a context where we had access to those foods?
Yeah, I find that pretty persuasive. I'd like to hear what the detractors of that theory, what their counter-argument is.
Yeah, I haven't seen any convincing counter-arguments myself. I mean, I think this is pretty convincing. And it's also interesting to note that the conversion of the plant-based forms of omega-3, like alpha-linolenic acid found in flax and walnuts that I just mentioned, is extremely poor. So it's, according to some studies, less than 0.5% of alpha-linolenic acid gets converted into DHA, which is ultimately what we're looking for from a brain health perspective or any other health perspective, which means you have to be eating a pretty considerable amount of those plant-based omega-3s in order to convert sufficient amounts to DHA. And that's assuming you have adequate nutritional status of other nutrients that are required for that conversion, which many people do not. So in practice, it becomes problematic for people to convert those plant-based omega-3s into the long-chain omega-3s. And the other issue with that is that a high intake of omega-6 fats suppresses that conversion. So omega-6 fats are things that are found in a lot of processed and refined foods like soybean oil and corn and safflower and sunflower oil. If you pick up any packaged food in the supermarket, it's going going to have those oils. And if you go out to eat at any restaurant, all of the food is cooked in those oils. So it's really hard to, even if you eat a healthy diet, to keep your omega-6 intake so low that it doesn't interfere with the conversion of those plant fats into DHA and EPA.
Because as I understand it, basically the conversion of both is using a lot of the same enzymes within the body. So if you're overstuffing the incoming pipes with omega-6s, there just aren't enough enzymes available to do the conversion of the precursors for omega-3s.
That's right. It's a competitive inhibition. And some researchers believe that that's one of many factors that causes our modern diet to be inflammatory.
Do you have any rules of thumb for people as far as balancing the types of fats that they're taking in, whether it's fully formed omega-3s or omega-6s within their diet, or if you're eating whole foods from animal sources, does that problem of keeping the ratio perfect kind of disappear?
Yeah, that's a great question. Early on, I was somewhat persuaded by studies suggesting that the omega-6 to 3 ratio should be kept around 2 to 1 or 4 to 1, which is in alignment with the historical ratio. So in other words, if you look at ancestral populations, contemporary hunter-gatherers, you see that they generally ate somewhere between an equal amount of omega-6 and 3s to maybe 4 times the amount of omega-6 relative to omega-3. And that was the historical norm. But today, that can be anywhere from 9 to 1 to 25 to 1.
Wow.
In the US. So it's a huge change, absolutely gigantic change, mostly mediated by the dramatic increase in consumption of industrial seed oils like soybean oil, which is in almost everything. And early on, it seemed that that ratio was a big driver of the chronic disease epidemic. As I began to dive further and further into the research, and believe me, there's a lot of controversy on this issue still. You'll see a lot of peer-reviewed studies on both sides. But I began to believe that the denominator is the most important thing, is more important than the numerator. So the denominator in this case is omega-3 intake. And my current understanding and recommendation is that you don't need to worry so much about omega-6 in the context of whole foods. So for example, if you eat an avocado, that's a huge hit of omega-6. And same with nuts. They're very high in omega-6. Chicken skin is high in omega-6. I don't really believe you have to worry about that. What I do think that omega-6 in the form of industrially processed seed oils may be problematic. And one reason for that is that it is probably more susceptible to oxidative damage, which we already talked about earlier, because of how it's processed and refined. Mm-hmm. Also, it doesn't occur in a natural context where other nutrients like antioxidants are present. So when you eat omega-6 in whole foods, you're also getting antioxidants that could potentially limit the oxidative stress that might be caused by a higher intake of those fragile oils. But when you're consuming industrial seed oils, those are really purified and refined and don't have any other nutrients. So you're just increasing your overall intake of fragile unsaturated fats without necessarily increasing your intake of antioxidants that would deal with that. So my current thing is just eat real food. That's what I generally tell people. Don't worry about the omega-6 in real food, but make sure to consume, depending on your weight and activity level and calorie intake, around 12 to 16 ounces of cold water fatty fish or shellfish each week, or the equivalent amount of DHA that you would get from algae if you are a vegan or can't or won't eat seafood for any reason.
Do you have any rules of thumb for how to define real food? Something you could explain to a 6 or a 7-year-old?
Yeah, so like a can of wild caught salmon, for example, is typically somewhere between 5 and 7.5 ounces. So if you ate 2 of those a week, you would be doing pretty well. Or a fillet of salmon that you might get at a restaurant could be anywhere from 6 to 8 ounces typically. So if you ate a couple of those a week, you'd be doing pretty well. Or you could eat a couple of 3-ounce servings of oysters. If you go to Whole Foods, there are smoked oysters, for example, in olive oil, and you could eat a tin of those along with maybe some salmon once a week, and that would be sufficient. So any of those combinations would be adequate.
What about cooking oils for food? I know that there's lots of things to be said about that, and maybe that's a deeper topic, but since most people are going to be using some form of cooking oil, do you like using the drippings of fat from meats? Do you like things like olive oil? Like, where should people be thinking there?
So with cooking, you always need to consider the smoke point of the oil, and that is essentially the point at which oil begins to oxidize. And from a practical perspective, it's the point at which you start to see smoke. So if you've ever put oil in a pan and then forgot about it and come back, you see smoke coming way up, that oil is becoming oxidized and it's not good to eat. Oil's that way. So there are charts online you can search for smoke point of oils, but the oils that have the highest smoke points are olive oil that is not extra virgin. So actually just somewhat refined olive oil. It's not a popular choice. It's actually really even hard to find in a store, but that has one of the highest smoke points and is a good cooking oil. Algae oil, this is a kind of a new oil that's come onto the scene. It's almost exclusively monounsaturated fat, which is more stable than the polyunsaturated fats, which means it has a pretty high smoke point. That's a good oil to cook with. Avocado oil and macadamia nut oil smoke points are relatively high. Expeller pressed coconut oil. So again, not extra virgin, which is what most people will typically buy, but expeller pressed, which means it's been refined, but it's naturally with an expeller instead of chemically refined. There are two advantages to cooking with expeller pressed oil, or three. One is that it doesn't have a strong coconut taste, which some people don't like. I personally don't like all my food to taste like coconut. So dishes that are made with extra virgin coconut oil for that reason. So that's one. Number two is it has a significantly higher smoke point than extra virgin coconut oil. And three is it's a lot cheaper. You can buy it in a gallon size and just keep it in a cupboard and transfer it into smaller jars. That's what we do. And then there are other ghee, which is butter oil, essentially. The fat with all of the proteins and everything else removed from butter. Ghee has a relatively high smoke point, is a good oil to cook with. And then we also, for roasting vegetables, which we do it not as high of a temperature as we would for sauteing, for example, we like to use lard, pasture-raised lard, and pasture-raised duck fat. Those fats impart a unique texture to food and vegetables and anything that you would roast in the oven. Most liquid oils make things soggy. If you roast vegetables in them and use liquid oils, they'll become a little bit soggy. But if you use duck fat or lard, that doesn't happen. They stay dry and crisp and relatively light and fluffy, which might be kind of counterintuitive to people until you realize that the primary fat that's used to make pie crust traditionally is lard for that reason, because it has that flaky, light texture. So it's kind of like use the right fat for the right temperature and the right application.
How did lard get such a bad name in the Western world?
I don't know. It's really interesting, especially because lard has a lot of monounsaturated fat, which is really, when you think about it, I can't think of a single dietary approach or philosophy that doesn't think that monounsaturated fat is good. And lard actually has more monounsaturated fat than saturated fat. It does have a significant amount of saturated fat. So for example, 3 ounces of lard has, I think, something like 35 grams of monounsaturated and 27 of saturated, and then 9 grams of polyunsaturated. So yes, it is a significant source of saturated fat, but it's got more monounsaturated fat. I think it became demonized because it does have saturated fat, and because it kind of represented an older, more traditional approach to diet and food that used these traditional fats like lard and tallow and butter and duck fat. And when the whole saturated fat and heart disease connection, which has been also thrown into question, was the status quo, then all of those traditional fats that had a relatively high saturated fat content became the villains.
Right.
Somehow people convinced themselves that eating Crisco, which if you open the jar and put it in your garage, rats won't even touch, is healthier than eating duck fat or lard.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Chris Kresser for taking the time for that conversation. I thought the point that he made early on there about not slacking off on your diet just because you might be using supplements is a very good one. Not sure if that suspicion has been scientifically validated with testing, but probably squares with our best guesswork if we think of the little devil on our shoulder and how he might sometimes say, go ahead, eat that piece of pizza. You've got a great medicine cabinet at home. Definitely want to keep the earmuffs on for that guy. So important takeaways there include working whole food seafood into your diet. He liked shellfish a lot. He was saying 2 cans of salmon or maybe salmon fillets every week, or other fatty cold water fish, although salmon's a favorite for a lot of people. And also knowing the smoke points of your cooking oils. I hadn't heard that before about the virtues of non-virgin olive oil. Kind of makes you wonder why oil virginity is touted so highly in their marketing, but all that glitters is not gold. And unfortunately, when it comes to cooking oils, all that's gold does not necessarily glitter. If you work in the healthcare field and you're interested in Chris Kresser's work, and in particular learning more about functional medicine, the paleo diet, ancestral living, and how to work some of these ideas into your own practice, Chris Kresser actually has a clinician training program up at the KresserInstitute.com website. I think they're doing recurring enrollments quarterly or so on that one, but you might want to give it a look. As for the rest of you, I will see you in the seafood aisle. And now, let's move on to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
There have been a lot of scientific studies on the benefits of walking, both as far as cardiovascular health, mood, alertness, cognition, problem solving, creativity, all sorts of stuff, and generally walking bears out pretty well. Other than wear and tear on knee joints and dangers of banana peels, things like that, I don't think anybody has that many bad things to say about walking, scientifically or otherwise, but a pair of psychologists at Iowa State University were concerned that a lot of the research around mood and walking had confounding factors such as getting fresh air, being exposed to nature, the satisfaction of reaching fitness goals, or just the expectation of something good happening. So they designed a series of experiments around walking where they masked the motivation behind the experiment. Walking was not supposed to be what was being studied. In one case, students were given a walking tour of the campus that they were on, or an audiovisual tour with photos and videos, and they were all sitting in one place while it took place. The students were told it was a study of the effects of unfamiliar environments on mood, and they also checked to make sure that nobody had guessed the true aims of the study. It turned out that the students who took just a 12-minute walking tour of the campus afterwards had significantly more positive ratings on their mood in terms of feelings like joviality, vigor, attentiveness, and self-assurance. Since this wasn't technically exercise that was being studied, they refer to walking in their paper as incidental ambulation. In a second study, they tried to give students a sense of walking dread by warning them ahead of time that following the walk through the buildings, they would have to write a 2-page essay afterwards and also discuss their essay's contents. They didn't actually have to do this afterwards, but they were told they would just to make them have something unpleasant looming in the future. After being told this, all students expected that their mood would drop by the end of the tour, but it was found that while this was true in the students that just sat in one place, the students who did the walking tour seemed to override the sense of looming dread, apparently by virtue of the walking. And finally, as if that wasn't enough, they did a third study where students had to watch a video and answer questions about it while either sitting, standing, or actually walking on a treadmill. They were told that the test had to do with measuring the mood of people in proximity to gym equipment, as if it were some sort of exercise psychology study. But once again, the people that were walking on the treadmill rather than being stationary showed significantly higher moods by the study's end. The researchers' study was published in the journal Emotion, in which they conclude, taken together, our findings suggest that incidental ambulation has a more robust and pervasive effect than has been previously thought. People may underestimate the extent to which just getting off their couch and going for a walk will benefit their mood as they focus on momentarily perceived barriers rather than eventual mood benefits. So if you're taking a walk as you listen to this podcast, excellent. If not, work a walk into your day sometime soon.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so that's it. You have made it to the end of episode number 173. Thank you for hanging around until the end with us. If you're curious about the links to anything that we talked about here, all of that will be up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/173. Last week in episode number 172, we had our special St. Patrick's Day episode looking at alcohol abuse disorder and talking with not one but two experts. And next week, we're going to be looking at creativity and in particular, how sarcasm of all things can be useful in activating your creative sense. That can be both on the receiving and the delivering end of sarcasm, it turns out. Really interesting conversation there, so that'll be coming up next week in episode number 174. A couple of brain breakfasts have been out in the meantime, so a reminder, if you have not yet signed up for that, smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. And that is all for now. I will be back at you next Friday, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.